Among the voices heralding the notion of Jewish nationalism was the 19th century German Jewish socialist Moses Hess. He was given a Jewish education provided by his Orthodox grandfather, but by his early 20s, he was convinced that the Jewish mission in history was over. However, in the late 1850s, he came to appreciate Italian nationalism, and he began to understand what Jewish nationalism could accomplish. A thought which I believed to be forever buried in my heart has been revived in me anew. It is the thought of my nationality, which is inseparably connected with my ancestral heritage and the memories of the Holy Land, the eternal city, the birthplace of the belief in the divine unity of life, as well as the hope in the future brotherhood of men. Decades later, Hess's return to Judaism and Zionism would strike a chord in the father of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. After reading Hess's Rome and Jerusalem, published in 1862, Herzl wrote in 1901, "Everything we have tried is already in his book." The 1880s and 1890s are often identified as the period of Zionism's birth. At that time, a genuine cataclysm fell on Russian Jewry. But the greater the gloom and adversity of Jewish life, the more intense the recollection of ancestral pride. Small Jewish communities and academies sprouted up in Jerusalem, Tzfat, Jaffa, and Hebron. Palestine, after all, had never become the birthplace of any other nation. Every one of its conquerors had an original home somewhere else. The idea of Palestine as a Jewish land had never been obscured. The concept of Jewish nationhood converged in the 1800s with movements of national emancipation in Europe. The Zionist movement was led first by Theodor Herzl and then by Chaim Weizmann, who later became the first president of the State of Israel. Born in a Russian shtetl in 1874, Weizmann undertook university studies in Germany and Switzerland. He became a chemist in Manchester, England, before coming to lead the Zionist movement. Herzl and Weizmann didn't work in a vacuum. Jewish settlement in Israel preceded the development of political Zionism and then ran parallel with it. But money and manpower were needed. Funding for the yeshuv, the Hebrew word for settlement, came from the West, where the great Jewish fortunes of the 18th and 19th centuries were made. Along came Sir Moses Montefiore, who lived from 1784 to 1885, an Anglo-Jewish leader and Lord Mayor of London, who first visited Palestine in 1827. He worked tirelessly to bring agriculture and industry to the Holy Land. Montefiore was related by marriage to Nathan Mayer Rothschild, the head of the banking family's London branch. The House of Rothschild became a modern transnational organization, but most notable was its commitment and fidelity to Jewish welfare. The Baron Edmund James de Rothschild was the French philanthropist known as the father of the Yishuv, who saved the early settlements from collapse. His financing helped the Yishuv to expand after the turn of the century. These 19th century patrons of the Yishuv didn't settle in Palestine or aim to create a Jewish state. Instead, they felt a strong social and religious bond with their Jewish kinsmen. Political Zionism was based on the belief that Jews must have their own state. But for the early sponsors of the Yishuv, a Jewish state was beyond their ambition. They favored a refuge in the Holy Land for those who, due to religious conviction or persecution, just wanted to go there to live or die. True aliyah, the Hebrew word meaning ascent or going up, began in the 1880s. Where did the settlers come from? Not from the advanced West, but from the oppressed East. They came mostly from Russia. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by a group of bomb-throwing nihilists in St. Petersburg. One of its members was a Jewess, Hesia Mayarovna Helfman. She didn't throw the bomb, but was a propagandist for the revolutionaries. She was sentenced to death with 5 others. Pregnant at the time of the sentence, she died in prison in St. Petersburg after giving birth. Her alleged complicity was used by anti-Semites and the imperial government. The Tsar's successor, Alexander III, combined reactionary politics and extreme Russian nationalism. In April 1881, an anti-Jewish riot, or pogrom, broke out in Kiev. There was looting and property damage, rather than personal injury or loss of life, but repression became more systematic. The temporary regulations of May 1882, also known as the May Laws, declared, "It is decreed that the Jews be forbidden to settle anew outside of towns and boroughs, exceptions being admitted only in the case of existing Jewish agricultural colonies. Temporarily forbidden are the issuing of mortgages and other deeds to Jews, as well as the registration of Jews as lessees of real property situated outside of towns and boroughs. Jews are forbidden to transact business on Sundays and on the principal Christian holy days." Jews could no longer settle in rural villages, even within the Pale. Those Jews who left the villages for the towns, even briefly, were forbidden to return. Many small towns were reclassified as villages and closed to Jews. Quotas were issued, limiting access to universities and the professions. Jews were confined to the overcrowded cities of the Pale, where they were harassed by the police, who in turn were charged with enforcing the regulations. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were forcibly uprooted. The dream of Haskalah was dead. Many Jews continued to live in Russia, but the Tsars made it plain that the Jews had no true home. The Russian jurist, statesman, and advisor to 3 Tsars, Konstantin Petrovich Pobedonostsev, declared, "1/3 of the Jews will die out, 1/3 will leave the country, and 1/3 will be completely dissolved in the surrounding population." The pressures increased each year. Press censorship intensified, along with the drumbeat of anti-Semitic propaganda. A general expulsion of most of Moscow's 35,000 Jews began in 1891. Within a few years, only 5,000 Jews remained. Yet, the effect was the opposite of what was intended. Historically, the Jews had lent their support to the secular authorities. Now, for many Jews, especially the youth, persecution only intensified a growing resentment against the government. Each year, between 1881 and 1899, an average of 23,000 Jews left Russia. Most of these immigrants eventually settled in the United States. Fewer remained in Europe. Still fewer made the journey to Palestine. Between 1882 and 1903, only about 25,000 Jews came to the Holy Land. And those early pioneers faced serious hardships. There was a lack of money. The pioneers, or chalutzim in Hebrew, had few economic resources. Money from private philanthropists and from Russian and Romanian Zionists, organized loosely as the Chibat Zion, or Lovers of Zion, was slow in coming. And then there were political problems. Palestine was still Ottoman, and the Turkish authorities opposed Jewish immigration. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs were already living there. In 1914, non-Jews outnumbered Jews by 604,000 to 85,000. Early immigrants had no farming skills, and they gravitated toward the cities. Cheap Arab labor tilled the soil. One of the first to see the dangers of all this was Asher Ginsburg, also known as Ahad Ha'am, or one of the people. As the leader of Chibat Zion, he was one of the nonconformists of modern Hebrew literature. As an essayist, he was skeptical of the political aims of Herzl and the wisdom of the actions of Baron de Rothschild. He was equally skeptical of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an international Jewish self-help organization that conducted educational activities in the French spirit. In his essay, Truth from the Land of Israel, in 1891, he warned of the trouble. We abroad are accustomed to believe that Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is almost totally desolate at present. But in reality, it is not so. Arabs, especially those in towns, see and understand our activities and aims in the country, but keep quiet and pretend as if they did not know. And they try to exploit us too, and profit from the new guests while laughing at us in their hearts. But if the time comes and our people make such progress as to displace the people of the country, they will not lightly surrender the place. What say ye, Watson? Was Asher Ginsburg right? Might the Jews have been better off to find some place other than Palestine to establish a state? Or was Palestine the only answer? Palestine or bust? Jewish settlements that sought to attain agricultural self-sufficiency were also thwarted by the land itself, including malarial swamps. Furthermore, large-scale immigration to Israel required a political program. Yet political Zionism threatened the beliefs of Orthodox Jews. Then there was the problem of language. How could a nation come about when there was no common tongue? Enter ELIEZER BEN-YEHUDA, who was principally responsible for the revival of Hebrew as a spoken language. Having been used for nearly 2,000 years only as a liturgical language. He was born Eliezer Perlman in Luzhki, Lithuania in 1858. The son of a Chabad Hasid, Ben-YEHUDA was given a traditional religious education at a local yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva, or head of the school, was secretly a maskil, or enlightened thinker of the Haskalah. He introduced Ben-YEHUDA to secular literature and non-religious study. Ben-YEHUDA found additional inspiration in European nationalist movements. In the 19th century, Italy and Greece both countries with ties to ancient lands and languages became independent nations. In 1877, the Russo-Turkish War began and brought prominence to the Bulgarian national movement that sought independence from the Ottomans. Envisioning the Jews as a nation like any other, Ben-YEHUDA determined to help create a place where Jews could adopt Hebrew as their mother tongue. Arriving in Jerusalem in 1881, Ben-YEHUDA immediately put his plan of Hebrew revival into action. He left behind his birth name, and with his wife, Deborah Jonas, he created the first modern Hebrew-speaking household. He also raised the first modern Hebrew-speaking child, Ben Zion, Ben-YEHUDA. But the ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem, for whom Hebrew was used only for holy purposes, rejected him and his language. They even declared him a cherem, excommunicating him. But Ben-YEHUDA continued to speak Hebrew at home and convinced other families who were part of the growing community of secular Jewish nationalists in Palestine to do the same. In 1910, Ben-YEHUDA began publication of his dictionary, but the full 17-volume set wasn't completed until well after his death in 1922. He never saw the creation of the State of Israel. He passed away only 1 month after the British authorities declared Hebrew to be the official language of the Jews of Palestine. But his dream of Israel be'arzo u'veloshono, Israel in its land and with its language, the rebirth of the nation of Israel in its own land, speaking its own language, came to fruition indeed. While Ben-YEHUDA was struggling to revive Hebrew, the first Zionist Congress was meeting at Basel, Switzerland in August 1897. The official aim of Zionism was to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine, secured by public law. The founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, offered to buy Palestine from the Ottoman Turks in exchange for paying the Turkish public debt, freeing the Ottoman rulers from a crippling weakness in dealing with the Europeans. But the Ottomans refused. Later on, Herzl considered Argentina as an alternative to the land of Israel, as a desirable location for a Jewish homeland. The proposal was investigated, but in the end voted down by the 7th Zionist Congress. 1903 saw the eruption of the Kishinev pogrom, in which at least 49 Jews were killed and more than 500 injured. The British government tried to help by offering Herzl Uganda as a Jewish home. A commission actually traveled to East Africa to evaluate the proposal. But the Uganda plan, likewise, was soon aborted, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste. Herzl, worn down by a decade of constant struggle, died of cardiac sclerosis on July 3, 1904. In the meantime, a young chemist in Geneva, Chaim Weizmann, moved to England. In Manchester, he pursued a career in chemistry. He became the leader of the Zionist movement, so that at Herzl's death, the major organs of the movement were in place. The Zionist Organization, the Jewish Colonial Trust, and the Jewish National Fund. The Kishinev pogrom became a new impetus for Russian Jewish emigration. The proportion of Jews settling in Palestine was small, but newcomers increased from about 1,000 a year during 1882 to 1904, to 3,000 annually during 1904 to 1914. In 1906, during World War I, Weizmann met Arthur James Balfour, the first Earl of Balfour, following Balfour's loss of the prime ministership. He also made friends with Herbert Samuel, the first Jew to enter the cabinet in Britain, and later the first High Commissioner for Palestine. And he befriended David Lloyd George, Minister of Munitions in 1915 and Prime Minister the following year. Weizmann developed a new process for the production of acetone, used in the production of munitions. When Balfour became Foreign Secretary in Lloyd George's cabinet, all the ducks were in a row for a British endorsement of Zionism. On November 2nd, 1917, a letter signed by Lord Balfour was sent to Lord Rothschild, the unofficial leader of British Jewry. The declaration read, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Perhaps the British saw a Jewish Commonwealth as a means of maintaining British control over the region. Or perhaps they viewed the declaration as a way of destabilizing Turkey and making it topple more quickly. But the Balfour Declaration was an authentic turning point in Jewish history. Before, the idea of a Jewish nation in Israel, the land of Israel, seemed a hopeless dream. But as Herzl had said, if you will it, it is not a dream. The Declaration was hailed by Western Zionists, though they must have been troubled by its vagueness. Questions remained. What kind of national home was envisioned? A state, or simply a refuge? How large would it be? And who would administer it? And what about the Arabs?